The sun was barely up over the far hills when the wind rolled across the empty fields, stirring the brittle grass and whispering through the old fence posts. The ranch had grown quiet over the years, too quiet ever since she was buried beneath the cottonwood by the riverbank. The man who owned this land used to talk to her every morning before work, her laughter echoing through the house. Now he only spoke to the wind. The ranch still stood strong, though the paint had long faded from the porch rails, and the barn doors leaned tiredly on their hinges. Every board, every nail, every sound of creaking would reminded him of the life he'd lost. Folks in town said he had gone silent after the funeral. That grief had carved its name into his back and shoulders the way the sun had done to the land. He still woke before dawn out of habit, poured his coffee black, and stared across the plains, as if expecting her to walk out of the mist. He talked to his horse more than he talked to people. He didn't hate company, but company didn't know what to say to a man who'd lost everything. They left him alone, which was fine by him. Loneliness had become a kind of armor. The rancher worked his fields, mended fences, and fixed tools with a steady hand that never seemed to rest. Work was the only thing that didn't ache. The night before the twins appeared, a storm swept across the valley. The sky turned black as if God himself had drawn his hand over the sun. Lightning struck the hills, thunder rolled through the canyons, and rain hammered the tin roof of the old house like it was trying to wake the dead. He sat by the window, boots on the table, eyes lost in the dark. He thought about her, the way she smiled when the rain came, the way she used to say storms washed away sorrow. But that storm didn't wash anything clean. It only brought back memories and a cold ache in his chest that never seemed to leave. The next morning, the air smelled of wet earth and pine. The sky was soft blue, and a thin mist lingered around the corral. He was saddling his horse when he noticed movement by the gate, two small figures standing side by side, half hidden behind the fence. For a second, he thought his mind was playing tricks on him. But as he stepped closer, he saw them clearly, two little boys, maybe 5 or 6, wearing patched-up suspenders and dusty boots, their hair tangled and their cheeks pale from the chill. They didn't speak at first. They just stared at him with the kind of stillness that only children lost in a strange world could have. One of them held a small wooden horse, worn smooth from being carried too much. The other clutched a small cloth bundle against his chest. The rancher frowned, squinting in the sunlight. "You boys lost?" he asked, his voice rough from disuse. They didn't answer. They just looked at each other, then back at him. And then the smaller one stepped forward and said something that made the ground seem to tilt under his feet. "Daddy?" The word hit him like a hammer. For a long time, he couldn't breathe. He just stared at them, his hands tightening around the saddle strap. "What did you say?" he asked, softer this time, as if afraid to hear it again. The boy looked up at him with wide, steady eyes and repeated, "Daddy." The other boy nodded, his small face serious and certain. "Mama said we'd find you here." The first time in years, the rancher's knees felt weak. He crouched down slowly, trying to understand what he was seeing, what he was hearing. They looked nothing like her, yet something in their eyes, something in the shape of their faces, carried a trace of her spirit. He didn't know whether to reach for them or step back. His heart was thundering like the storm that had passed the night before. "Where's your mama?" he finally managed to ask. The boys looked at each other again. "She told us to come here," the older one said. "She said you'd take care of us." His throat closed up. He wanted to ask more, where she was, how they had found their way here. What kind of cruel joke this could be, but the boys just stood there, silent and calm, as if they belonged. He looked past them down the dirt road. But there was no wagon, no rider, no sign of anyone else. Just the empty horizon and the whisper of wind through the grass. The twins were alone. He tried to reason it out. Maybe they were lost travelers. But maybe someone from town sent them. But no one knew his past well enough to weave a lie like this. And yet, their small voices, their quiet certainty, pierced through every wall he'd built around his heart. The rancher took a slow breath and said, "Come inside." His voice cracked on the words. They followed him across the yard, their small boots making soft prints in the damp earth. The house smelled faintly of smoke and coffee. He pulled out 2 chairs by the table and poured milk into tin cups, the same way she used to for guests. The boys sat politely, looking around like they were remembering something. "Mama told us you had a big house," one said. "She said there were horses, too." He swallowed hard, nodding. "There are," he said quietly. "Plenty." When the sun rose higher, he stepped outside again, trying to steady himself. The wind tugged at his shirt, and the world seemed to sway between the past and the present. Those boys were a mystery he wasn't ready for. Every glance at them stirred questions he didn't have the strength to ask. Could she have, somehow, lived long enough to bear them? Could they really be his? Or was fate simply playing a cruel game, reminding him of what he'd lost? He looked toward the hills where the storm had rolled through and saw a small figure in the distance. Or maybe just a shadow, a trick of light. He blinked, and it was gone. The air felt heavy, as if something unseen was watching. He turned back toward the house. Through the open window, he could see the boys sitting side by side, their heads bent together, whispering about something. The sight twisted his heart. He didn't know whether to believe them or fear what believing would mean by noon. The town sheriff rode up the path, dust trailing behind his horse. "Heard you got visitors," he said, tipping his hat. "2 kids showed up at Mrs. Hill's store yesterday asking about this ranch. Thought maybe you'd know something." The rancher said nothing. He just looked at the boys through the window, then back at the sheriff. "They came this morning," he said quietly. "Said their mother sent them." The sheriff frowned. "Their mother? Who is she?" The rancher's jaw tightened. "They didn't say." The sheriff dismounted, glancing toward the horizon. "Well, I'll ask around. No woman in town's been traveling with kids that I've heard of." He paused, lowering his voice. "You think it could be? Her kin?" The rancher didn't answer. The word "her" still burned too deep. He only nodded faintly, and the sheriff rode off again, leaving a trail of dust behind. As evening fell, the house grew quiet again. The boys had fallen asleep by the hearth, curled under an old quilt. He sat nearby, staring into the fire, every thought circling back to the same question. If they were truly hers and his, then who had brought them here? And why now, after all this time? Outside, the wind shifted. Somewhere in the dark, a horse neighed softly, followed by the faint creak of a gate. He stood up, heart pounding, and moved to the door. The yard lay still under the moonlight, but something in the air had changed, like a memory returning to life. He stepped out onto the porch, the boards creaking beneath his boots, and listened. The night was quiet except for the whisper of the wind and the soft crackle of the dying fire behind him. Yet he couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was out there watching. His eyes searched the dark edge of the fields, and for an instant, he thought he saw her silhouette near the cottonwood by the river. Then it vanished. He took a step forward, the cool night air brushing his face. The world felt suspended, caught between truth and memory. Inside the house, the twins stirred in their sleep, murmuring softly, and one of them whispered her name. The morning came slow, painted in soft gold and silver light. The rancher barely slept, sitting by the window with the rifle across his knees and a head full of questions he couldn't silence. The 2 boys were still asleep near the hearth, their faces calm and untouched by the worries that tore at his mind. They breathed evenly, one turning in his sleep and whispering something that sounded like her name again. He felt a sting behind his eyes, the kind a man doesn't admit to. He stood there for a long time watching the fire burn low, wondering what kind of world could twist itself enough to bring to lost. Children to his door, calling him Daddy. He made breakfast the same way he had for years, coffee strong, enough to bite and biscuits baked hard on the edges. When the twins woke, they ate without fuss, their small hands steady, as if they'd been raised on long roads and hard living. They thanked him quietly and looked around the kitchen, noticing everything: the faded curtains, the empty chair at the table, the small picture frame turned face down near the window. One of them asked if the woman in the frame was Mama. He froze for a second before answering. "Yes," he said, barely above a whisper. "That's her." The boy nodded, his little fingers brushing the wooden edge of the frame, as if trying to feel something beyond the photograph. The ranch had once been a place of laughter and warmth. Back when she was alive, there were wildflowers on the porch and music in the evenings. She used to hum while she cooked, her voice soft but steady, filling the empty spaces between the ticking of the clock and the lowing of the cattle. She loved the land more than most people loved comfort. "This land keeps us honest," she used to say. "It gives what you earn, no more, no less." He remembered the way she'd stand in the field, sunlight caught in her hair, saying that storms never scared her. They reminded her that the sky still had power. Then one winter night, the fever took her. No storm could wash that away. After she died, he buried her under the cottonwood where they had carved their initials years ago. Folks from town came to pay respects, but once they left, the world fell silent again. The seasons passed, one after another, and he worked the ranch like a man who didn't know how to stop. But seeing those twins now brought the past roaring back like thunder. They looked too much like her to be coincidence, the same shade of hair, the same stubborn spark in their eyes. And yet he had no memory of them, no message, no sign that she had ever given birth to anyone after the fever. As the sun climbed higher, he took the boys outside to the corral. The horses stirred as he opened the gate. The twins stood side by side, eyes wide with curiosity, the same way she used to look at the herd when they first started building their life here. "You ever ride before?" he asked. The older boy nodded proudly. "Mama taught us." The rancher froze again. "She did, huh?" he said slowly. The boy nodded again. "She said horses remember kindness, just like people." He looked down at the dusty ground, his heart twisting in his chest. That was her saying, every word of it. He lifted one boy up onto the gentlest mare in the corral, guiding his hands to the reins. The way the child sat, calm and sure, reminded him too much of her. He swallowed hard. The other twin watched closely, mirroring every motion, learning quick. There was something hauntingly familiar in the way they moved, not just in how they looked, but in how they carried themselves. Like pieces of her spirit had found their way into two small bodies and come back to test his faith around midday. An old friend rode in from town, a grizzled man who'd worked alongside him since before the war. He dismounted slowly, glancing toward the porch where the boys sat playing with small stones. "Heard you had visitors," he said, tying his reins. "That true?" The rancher nodded. "Two of them." His friend's gaze softened. "They kin?" The rancher didn't answer right away. He just rubbed his hands together, eyes fixed on the distant cottonwood tree. "They say their mother sent them," he finally said. "Said she told them to find me." The old man frowned, studying his face. "And who's their mother supposed to be?" The rancher hesitated, then looked up. "They said her name," he whispered. "They said her." Silence settled between them. The older man took off his hat and ran a hand through his gray hair. "You know that can't be right," he said gently. "She's been gone near 6 years now." The rancher nodded, voice low. "I buried her myself," the friend sighed, glancing at the twins again. "Could be someone's trick, or someone trying to stir old ghosts." "You sure you want to keep him here?" The rancher's gaze hardened. "They're just boys," he said. "They got no one else." The old man studied him for a long moment, then nodded. "You always did have a stubborn heart," he muttered, before turning his horse toward the hills again. As the afternoon wore on, clouds began gathering over the valley again. The wind carried a strange chill, the kind that made the hair on the back of your neck stand. The twins were quiet that evening, sitting close together by the fire. They whispered to each other in a tone that made him uneasy, not because of what they said, but because of how they said it. It was calm, almost knowing, as if they understood something he didn't. At one point, younger one looked up and asked, "Daddy, are you sad?" He froze, caught off guard. "Why would you ask that?" The boy tilted his head. "Mama said you'd still be sad when we found you, but she said we'd fix it." The words hung in the air like smoke. He didn't answer. He couldn't. He just stared at the fire and felt the ache in his chest deepen. They talked about her as if she were still somewhere, not gone, but waiting. "She said we'd see her again," the other boy added softly. When the stars come out, his stomach tightened. He wanted to believe in miracles, but he'd spent too many years burying them. Still, something about those words gnawed at him, something that refused to let go. That night, after the boys had gone to sleep, he stepped out into the yard. The moon hung high, silver and cold. The cottonwood tree swayed gently in the wind. He walked down to it, boots crunching on the frosted grass. The name carved into the bark was still there, hers and his, side by side, half faded, but not forgotten. He stood there for a long time, staring at the grave below. "What did you do?" he whispered to the quiet air. "If this is your doing, give me a sign." The wind answered with a low sigh, brushing past his face like a touch. He closed his eyes, feeling the sting of it deep inside. When he turned to go back, he saw footprints near the edge of the path, small ones, freshly pressed in the dirt. He followed them with slow steps, his heart thudding in his chest. The tracks led not to the house, but toward the barn. He pushed the door open, the hinges creaking. Inside, the lantern light flickered weakly. The twins were standing by the stall, their little faces pale in the glow. "What are you doing out here?" he asked, his voice sharper than he meant. They turned toward him calmly. "We heard her," the older one said. "Mama's voice. She said she's close." He felt his blood run cold. "You must have been dreaming," he said, kneeling beside them. "There's no one here but us." The boys shook their heads. "She said she'd come when the river glows," the younger one whispered. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came. Outside, a low rumble of thunder rolled across the valley. The storm was coming back. He took their hands gently and led them inside. As he tucked them into bed, the wind howled against the windows, making the old house tremble. When the fire died down, he lay awake in his chair, listening. The ranch creaked with the shifting wind, the same way it always had. But beneath that, there was something else, a faint hum, like a woman's voice carried on the breeze. He rose quietly, stepping to the window. The cottonwood was swaying under the moonlight, and for a heartbeat, he thought he saw her again, standing beneath it, her hand resting where their names were carved. Then a flash of lightning lit the sky, and the image vanished. He stood there long after the thunder faded, the words of the twins echoing in his mind. The river glows. The storm deepened outside, rain beginning to fall in steady sheets. Somewhere beyond the fields, the faintest shimmer of light appeared near the riverbank, like moonlight dancing on the water where no moon should reach. And in that moment, he realized the mystery was far from over. Whatever truth waited there in the shadows of his land was just beginning to show itself. It would change everything he thought he knew about life, loss, and the woman he still loved. The following morning was gray and heavy, the kind of sky that pressed low enough to make a man feel the weight of his own thoughts. The rancher hadn't slept at all. He sat by the window again, staring toward the river, trying to understand what he had seen, or thought he had seen. The faint glow that had shimmered through the night still burned in his memory like a haunting echo. It wasn't natural light. It came from the river itself, from the same place where he had buried her years ago. The boys slept soundly, as if untouched by what had happened, but he couldn't shake the feeling that they knew more than they were letting on. He went out after sunrise, his boots sinking into damp soil. The storm had passed, but the land still smelled of rain and wild sage. As he walked toward the river, a fog hung low over the ground, curling around his legs like ghostly smoke. The cottonwood stood silent, its branches wet with dew. When he reached the grave, he saw something that stopped him cold. The earth around it was disturbed, not dug up, but uneven, like it had been touched. There were no boot prints, only the faint impressions of small feet, the same size as the twins. His stomach tightened. He looked back toward the house, his heart pounding. They couldn't have wandered out here alone in the storm, could they? Back inside, the twins were sitting quietly at the table, their hair still tousled from sleep. The older one looked up as he entered. "You went to see her," he said, his tone calm and matter-of-fact. The rancher froze mid-step. "What did you just say?" The boy shrugged softly. "Mama said you'd go look for her." The words felt like ice running down his spine. "How would you know that?" he asked slowly. The boy didn't answer. He just looked down at his hands, tracing patterns on the wooden table. The younger twin spoke instead, his voice small. "She told us you're scared to believe." He sat down heavily, the chair creaking under his weight. "Listen," he said, his voice low. "Your mama's gone. She passed away long ago. You boys are confused, that's all." But the twins just watched him with eyes that didn't blink, calm as still water. "She isn't gone," the older one whispered. "She told us to stay until you see her again." Something inside him cracked at those words. He wanted to shout, to demand answers, but instead he felt an ache rise from deep inside. That old quiet pain that never fully healed. He spent the rest of the day working the land just to clear his mind. The cattle had wandered near the ridge, and fixing the fence gave his hands something to do besides tremble. But even there, away from the house, the twins' words followed him. He remembered the fever that took her, how sudden it had come, how helpless he'd felt. He had sat by her bedside for 2 nights, praying, holding her hand as her breathing faded. He had buried her himself and marked the grave with his own hands. He knew she was gone. Yet deep down a voice kept whispering, what if he had been wrong? Later that afternoon, the sheriff came riding up again, dust swirling behind his horse. "Heard there was strange talk out this way," he said as he dismounted. "Folks in town are saying they saw lights down by your river last night." The rancher stiffened. "Lights," he repeated. The sheriff nodded. "Like lanterns, but brighter. Some say it looked like a woman walking along the bank." He gave a half-smile that didn't reach his eyes. "You wouldn't know anything about that, would you?" The rancher shook his head. "Nothing I can explain." The sheriff studied him for a long moment, then his gaze shifted to the house. "Those boys still here?" he asked. The rancher nodded. "Inside?" The sheriff lowered his voice. "You know, I checked with every family within 20 miles. No one's missing twins. No one's missing any children at all." The rancher frowned. "Then where'd they come from?" The sheriff sighed. "That's what I'd like to know. They showed up after a storm, claimed to be yours, and no one's seen them before that day." He hesitated, then added, "You might want to keep an eye open. Sometimes when the past comes calling, it brings trouble with it." With that, he tipped his hat and rode off, leaving more questions than answers. That night, the wind picked up again. The house groaned softly as the boards shifted. The twins had gone quiet after supper, sitting near the fire and drawing on scraps of paper. When he looked over, he realized what they were sketching: the cottonwood tree, the river, and a figure standing beside it. The figure was a woman. "Who's that?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Mama," the older one said simply. "She's waiting." He stared at the drawing, his pulse quickening. "Where?" The boy lifted his finger and pointed toward the river. He tried to laugh it off, tried to convince himself it was just imagination. But every sound outside, the creak of the porch, the rustle of grass, felt heavier that night. He kept the lamp burning longer than usual. Around midnight, the wind died down, and silence filled the house. He had just started to drift off when a faint knock echoed from the porch. Not hard or hurried, soft, deliberate, almost like someone who already knew they belonged there. He froze. The twins stirred slightly but didn't wake. The knock came again. He grabbed the lantern and walked slowly to the door. When he opened it, no one was there. The night stretched out, pale and silver under the moonlight. The air was still, except for the faint sound of the river running. Then, out of the corner of his eye, he caught a glimmer of figure by the cottonwood. His breath caught in his throat. The shape was faint, almost like mist taking form. It stood there for a moment, unmoving before fading into the fog. He shut the door slowly, his hands trembling. He knew he hadn't imagined it. By morning, he decided to ride into town. He needed to clear his head to speak to someone who might help him make sense of all this. He saddled his horse while the twins watched from the porch. "You don't have to go," the younger one said softly. "She doesn't want you to be afraid." He tried to smile, but it came out weak. "I'll be back before dark," he said. "Stay inside, both of you." The older one nodded, though his expression carried something far older than his years, a quiet understanding that unsettled him deeply in town. People gave him strange looks. Rumors had spread fast. Some whispered that he'd lost his mind, others that the ghosts of the valley were walking again. He ignored them and went straight to the old church. The preacher, a man who'd known his family for decades, greeted him at the door. "You look like you've seen a spirit," he said half-jokingly. "Maybe I have," the rancher replied, and told him everything, the twins, their words, the lights, the voice. The preacher listened carefully, his expression unreadable. When he finally spoke, his tone was cautious. "There are things in this land older than any of us," he said. "Sometimes the dead linger when love is left unfinished. Maybe she's trying to tell you something." The rancher shook his head. "I buried her, Reverend. I saw the life leave her." The preacher nodded slowly. "Maybe you buried her body, but not her promise." Those words followed him all the way home by the time he returned. The sky had turned strange again, streaks of red and violet bleeding into the horizon. The house was quiet, too quiet. He called for the twins, but there was no answer. Their chairs were empty, the fire cold. His heart slammed in his chest as he rushed outside. Small footprints led down the path toward the river. He ran faster than he had in years, his boots pounding against the earth. When he reached the cottonwood, the sight before him nearly brought him to his knees. The twins were standing at the edge of the glowing water, hand in hand. Staring into it as if it were a mirror, he shouted their names, but they didn't move. The glow pulsed brighter, casting their faces in an otherworldly light. "Get away from there," he cried, but they only turned to look at him. "It's all right, Daddy," the older one said softly. "She's here." And then, through the shimmer of light on the river, he saw her face, clear, gentle, and impossibly real. She looked just as she had before the fever, her eyes full of quiet sadness. His breath caught, and the world tilted again. He took a step forward, then another, torn between fear and longing. The twins didn't move, their small hands still clasped. The glow from the water began to fade, and her face along with it. "Wait," he called out, voice breaking. But the only answer was the whisper of the wind through the cottonwood leaves. The same sound it made on the night he buried her. The boys turned back to him, tears streaking their faces. "She said, 'You have to remember what you promised,'" the younger one said. She said, "It's not over yet." He knelt in the dirt, his hand shaking as he tried to steady his breath. "What promise?" he asked. But neither of them answered. They just looked toward the river again, where the faintest shimmer still rippled across the surface, a reminder that the past, no matter how deeply buried, wasn't done with him yet. The nights grew longer after that. The rancher stopped sleeping altogether, afraid that if he closed his eyes, the river would start glowing again, and he'd lose what little grip he had left on reason. The twins hardly spoke now, yet their silence carried weight, as though they were waiting for something they already knew would come. The cattle began acting strange, restless, spooked by shadows that weren't there. Even the horses refused to drink from the river. It was as if the land itself had begun remembering something it had been trying to forget. He spent the days, working harder than ever, fixing fences that didn't need fixing, chopping wood long after sundown, anything to keep his mind from circling back to that night under the cottonwood. But no matter how hard he tried, it's the sound of their voices, she said, "You have to remember what you promised," echoed through his thoughts like a curse. He didn't even know what promise they meant. Yet deep down, he felt the pull of something unfinished, something buried as deep as her grave. One evening, while checking the cattle near the ridge, he found tracks, hoofprints, wagon wheels, and smaller ones, like someone had come through the night before. They led toward the north, past the dry creek bed. The sight unsettled him. No one traveled this far without reason, and the prints were too fresh. He followed them a while, the sky burning orange behind him until they vanished near the rocks. That was when he saw a tan, old, weathered cross, half buried in the dust. It wasn't hers. It marked another grave. He crouched down, brushing the dirt away. There were initials carved into it, faint but clear. His breath caught when he saw her first name scratched there beneath another man's. He stood frozen, staring, his heart hammering. Whoever buried this had known her name. When he returned home, the twins were standing by the porch, waiting. The older one looked up and said quietly, "You found it." The words hit him like a blow. "Found what?" he asked. The boy's gaze didn't waver. "Her secret, The rancher's hands clenched at his sides. "What do you know about that place?" The child hesitated before answering. "Mama said not to be angry when you find out." He couldn't bear hearing more. That night, he sat outside with a lantern, the air thick with dust and crickets. Every part of him wanted to ride back to that grave and tear it open, to prove there was nothing there that could shake what little faith he had left. But another part, the one that still carried her memory, held him still. He kept his eyes on the horizon, where the faint shimmer of the river caught the moonlight. The cottonwood stood like a shadowed sentinel against the night. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote cried. Just before dawn, he woke to the sound of the twins whispering near the fireplace. Their voices were low, rhythmic, almost like a prayer. "She said it's time," one of them murmured. "The river's calling." He rose quietly and stepped closer. "What are you saying?" They looked up in unison, their faces calm, unafraid. "She's waiting at the water," the younger one said. His stomach tightened. "You're not going anywhere near that river again," he said, his voice rough with fear, but they didn't answer. They simply turned their gaze toward the window, where the first light of morning painted the curtains pale gold. That day, he worked near the barn, but kept checking the house every few minutes, half expecting them to vanish again. He tried to keep them close, fed them, talked to them, even showed them how to mend a fence. They followed his every move, silent and watchful, as if memorizing his face. When the evening came, the wind began to rise, carrying the scent of rain. Dark clouds rolled over the valley. The air felt charged, alive, like something was building beneath the surface of the land itself. He could sense it in the animals, 2 horses snorting, cattle shifting nervously. The sheriff showed up again that night, his horse sweating and uneasy. "You all right out here?" he asked, eyes flicking toward the horizon. "Storm's comin', and half the town swears they've seen lights near your river again." The rancher didn't answer at first. He just stared past the sheriff toward the cottonwood tree swaying in the distance. "There's something wrong with this place," he finally said. "I buried her there, but it's like she never left." The sheriff's expression hardened. "You think it's her ghost?" The rancher's jaw tightened. "I think it's something worse." Thunder cracked overhead, splitting the sky. The sheriff looked uneasy. "I'll stay tonight," he said. "No harm keeping watch." They sat on the porch for hours, the twins asleep inside. The rain began softly, then grew heavier, drumming against the roof. Around midnight, lightning flashed, lighting the valley in white for an instant. And there by the river, the glow returned brighter than ever. The sheriff cursed under his breath. What in God's name? He stood, hand on his revolver, though they both knew bullets wouldn't fix whatever this was. The rancher grabbed his lantern. "Stay here," he said, his voice shaking. "I have to see it for myself." He crossed the field, rain soaking him to the bone. The closer he got, the stronger the light grew, until it felt like walking into a dream. The river shimmered like molten silver, and beside it stood that same figure clearer now.
Face unmistakable.
Her, the woman he had buried. Her dress flowed like mist, her face pale and luminous. "Why?" he whispered. "Why won't you rest?" She looked at him with sorrowful eyes, lips barely moving. "Because you forgot." Behind him, he heard movement, small footsteps splashing through the wet grass. The twins. They had followed him. "No," he shouted, reaching for them, but they slipped past, walking straight toward the river's edge. The glow brightened, reflecting off their faces. The older twin turned back once and said, "She wants you to come with us." The words tore through him. "I can't," he said, his voice breaking. "You're not supposed to be here?" The sheriff's shout carried faintly over the thunder, but it was too late. The river surged suddenly, the light within it pulsing like a heartbeat. The air crackled, electric and alive. The twins stood still, hands clasped, eyes wide. The woman's image wavered, her face flickering between sorrow and something he couldn't name. The rancher took a step forward, then another, fighting against the wind and the rising current. Every instinct screamed for him to stop, but something stronger, love, guilt, desperation pushed him onward. When he reached the edge, the ground gave way beneath his boots. The current dragged at him, but he held his ground. "If you're real," he shouted into the storm, "then tell me what I forgot." The glow flared brighter, blinding him. For a moment, everything went silent except for the pounding of his heart. Then her voice came, soft but unmistakable, rising above the wind. "You promised you'd never leave." He stumbled back, breath catching in his throat. "I didn't," he said, his voice cracking. "You left me." The river answered with a roar, waves crashing against the banks. The twins cried out as the water reached their knees, but they didn't move away. "She said it's the only way," one of them shouted over the thunder. The sheriff's lantern appeared far behind, his voice faint, yelling for them to come back. But the rancher couldn't move. He stood caught between two worlds, one he could see, and one that seemed to be pulling him under. Then, without warning, lightning struck the cottonwood tree. The flash lit the valley in white, the sound shaking the ground. The tree split down the middle, burning bright against the dark sky. The twins screamed as the river surged higher, the glow turning fierce and wild. He lunged forward, grabbing them both by the arms, dragging them back onto the bank. The light flared once more, swallowing the figure of the woman completely. When it faded, only darkness remained, and the rain poured down harder than ever. The sheriff reached them moments later, breathless and drenched. "What the hell happened?" he shouted. The rancher didn't answer. He was on his knees in the mud, holding the twins close, his eyes fixed on the river that now ran dark and still. In the distance, the broken cottonwoods smoked against the rain, its fallen branches scattered across the ground like bones. The twins clung to him, trembling but silent. The sheriff touched his shoulder. "We need to get back to the house," he nodded faintly, but his gaze never left the river. Something had changed in the water's reflection. It wasn't glowing anymore, but faint ripples kept forming as though something beneath the surface still moved. The storm raged around them, thunder rolling across the hills, lightning flashing again and again. And somewhere deep inside, the rancher knew this wasn't over. As he carried the boys back to the house, he could still hear her voice. Not in the wind, not in the rain, but inside his own mind, quiet and cold. "You promised." The words lingered, sinking into him like the weight of the storm itself. And as the door closed behind them and the wind screamed outside, he realized the real battle hadn't begun yet. Something was still waiting in the dark river, something that would not rest until he remembered everything. The storm eased by dawn, but the valley didn't feel calm. The world outside seemed washed clean, yet beneath that quiet stillness lingered something heavy, like breath held too long. The rancher sat by the fire, soaked clothes drying by the hearth, the twins curled beside him under a blanket. The sheriff had left before sunrise, promising to check back after the floodwaters went down. But deep down, the rancher knew no lawman could explain what he had seen. There was no crime to chase, no outlaw to catch, only a truth buried beneath grief, waiting to be faced. When the light crept through the curtains, he finally looked at the boys. They were awake, but pretending not to be, their small hands gripping the edge of the blanket. "She's gone now," he said softly, though part of him wasn't sure. The younger twin looked up. "She's not gone," he whispered. "She's resting." "You kept your promise." The rancher frowned, confusion and exhaustion weighing him down. "What promise?" he asked quietly. "What did I promise her?" The boy's eyes filled with tears. "You said you'd stay. You said no matter what happened, you'd take care of us." The words landed like a blow. He remembered not clearly, but enough. Years ago, before the fever, she had held his hand by the river and told him that if anything ever happened to her, he mustn't leave the ranch. "It's where our life began," she had said. "It'll be where it ends, too." Back then, he'd laughed, thinking she was talking about growing old together. But now her words sounded like something more, a plea, a warning, or perhaps both. He went outside to the porch, the sky still gray from the storm. The cottonwood tree was split in half, smoke still rising from where lightning had struck. The air smelled of wet earth and ash. He walked slowly toward it, boots sinking into the soft ground. The river beside it had calmed, the glow gone. Only the faintest shimmer remained, like a reflection that refused to fade completely. He knelt beside the broken trunk, tracing his fingers over the carved initials that had somehow survived the fire. For the first time in years, he spoke aloud to her name. "I never left," he said. "You were the one who stayed." Behind him, he heard the boy's footsteps. They stood silently, side by side, their faces pale in the morning light. The older one carried something in his hand, a small wooden horse. "Mama said this belongs to you," he said, holding it out. The rancher took it carefully. He remembered carving it long ago, during the first winter they spent together, back when hope still had a shape and love was as simple as breath. The toy was worn now, edges rounded smooth by time. He turned it in his palm and felt something loosen in his chest, not pain this time, but release. As the day passed, the storm gave way to sunlight. He worked quietly around the house, fixing shutters, stacking wood, and mending the porch rail. The twins followed him everywhere, their questions fewer now, their presence steady and strange, like they were meant to be there. Every now and then, he'd catch them glancing toward the river, as if expecting something. But the water stayed still, and that silence was enough. By evening, he sat with them on the porch. The air was cool, scented with sage and damp cedar. They ate supper together, and for the first time, the ranch didn't feel empty. The older boy asked, "Are we staying here?" The rancher nodded slowly. "As long as you want," he said. "This land's yours as much as mine." The words came naturally, and they felt right. He didn't need proof anymore. Blood or not, they carried her memory, and that was enough to call them his. As the stars began to appear, he told them stories, the kind she used to tell him by the fire when the nights got too long. He talked about the early days of the ranch, the dust storms they'd fought through, the laughter they'd shared when the cattle broke loose and they had to chase them across the valley. The boys listened wide-eyed, as if hearing their mother's memories through his voice. When he paused, the younger one leaned against his arm and whispered, "She'd be happy now." He looked down at him and managed a smile. "Maybe she is." Later that night, when the twins were asleep, he walked down to the river one last time. The moon was high, and its light shimmered across the surface like silver lace. He stood there a long while, listening to the soft ripple of water. It no longer felt haunted. It felt alive, peaceful. He realized then that she hadn't been trying to pull him under. She had been trying to let him go. The glow, the voice, the storm, it was her way of reminding him that love wasn't meant to keep someone trapped in grief. It was meant to carry them forward. He whispered into the night, "I kept my promise." The wind stirred through the broken cottonwood, brushing his face like a familiar hand. The river moved gently, almost like an answer. He stayed there until the first light touched the horizon, then turned back toward the house. The twins were standing in the doorway, sleepy-eyed and wrapped in their blankets. "You all right, Daddy?" the younger one asked. He smiled, not forced, but real. "Yeah," he said softly. "I think I am." The seasons changed after that. Spring brought new grass, the cattle grew strong, and laughter returned to the house. The twins grew taller, their voices filling the air where silence used to live. The ranch began to breathe again, its fields alive with work and purpose. The man who once spoke only to the wind now found his voice in small moments, teaching, laughing, telling stories of the woman they never truly lost. Sometimes, on quiet evenings, when the sun dipped low behind the hills, he'd walk to the river and stand by what remained of the cottonwood. The stump had started sprouting again, small green shoots pushing up from the charred wood. He took it as a sign not of ghosts or curses, but of life returning. He'd close his eyes and imagine her there, smiling the way she used to when the land was kind. And for a moment, he'd swear he could hear her voice blending with the rustle of leaves, soft and forgiving. Years later, when the twins were nearly grown, they asked him about that storm, about the night the river glowed and their mother's voice filled the valley. He never told them everything. Some things, he said, were better left between the living and the lost. But he told them this much. Love doesn't end. It changes. It finds its way back in different forms, through people, through memories, through the land that remembers us. They carried those words with them. The same way he carried her memory, the ranch became known again as a place of quiet strength. Travelers passing through the valley often spoke of how the air felt calm there, how the water near the cottonwood seemed to shine brighter than anywhere else. Some said it was just the light, but those who stayed longer swore it was something more like the land. Self had learned to forgive. In the final years of his life, the rancher sat often on that porch with the twins beside him. Now young men running the land the way he once did, he'd watch them work, proud and grateful, and when he looked toward the river, his heart no longer ached. It simply beat steady, full, whole, at peace. When he finally closed his eyes one last time, they buried him under the cottonwood, beside the woman he had never stopped loving. The river flowed quietly nearby, carrying their reflection in its current. And when the wind moved through the leaves, carried a whisper only the valley could understand. A reminder that some promises don't bind the living to the dead. They set both free. The ranch endured. The twins kept it alive and under that wide western sky. Love, the kind that survives storms, grief, and time itself, remained.